Topic of today's discussion is about cerebellum. Okay, coming to an introduction, cerebellum, Latin, it means small brain. So it is small in size when compared to the parts of the brain, and it serves important functions for maintaining mainly the tone, the posture, and the equilibrium of the body. Okay, so when compared to the brain as a whole, when compared to the parts of the brain as a whole, cerebellum is the second most largest part of the brain, and its location is it's mainly a part of hindbrain, and it's the largest part of the hindbrain, and it is located in the posterior cranial fossa. So the cranial fossa is again divided into anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa, and cerebellum is the largest component of the posterior cranial fossa, and it is separated from the other parts of the brain by means of a dural fold known as stentorium cerebelli. Okay, and usually when compared to the cerebrum, cerebellum controls the same side of the body or the ipsilateral side of the body, whereas most of the parts of the cerebrum, they are dealing with the opposite or the contralateral side of the body. And here in cerebellum, we have outer gray matter and inner white matter. Just like the cerebrum structure, it has an outer gray matter and an inner white matter. And the gray matter in cerebellum, that is highly folded. About 10 to 15% only can be appreciated in outward, and the rest other part is seen within the grooves. Okay, so it's a folded structures, just like numerous branches. There are white matter inside the gray matter. Okay, so outside we have the gray matter or the cerebral cortex, and inside we can see the white matter. That's the basic structure of cerebellum. So gray matter is highly folded to accommodate millions of neurons. Okay, this folding is to increase the surface area, and the main part of the gray matter that we see outside is only a minor portion. Rest other is hidden within the folds. And such a structural arrangement is called arbor vitae or the vital life of tree. Okay, and the structure of cerebellum, it's generally uniform when compared to the cerebrum. Cerebrum is not uniform or homotypical, it's heterotypical, whereas in cerebellum, its structure is almost uniform. And its damage has a very typical symptoms. Okay, that's affecting the tone, the muscle tone. When it's affected, it will lead to hypotonia, and postural equilibrium, etc. are affected by the damage to the cerebellum. So this is the structure. We can see the gray matter is thrown into numerous folds, just like the branches of a tree. That's why it is called arbor vitae of cerebellum. Okay, the structure is arbor vitae or arborizing or branching pattern. Okay. So that's a structure of cerebellum. So what's the location of cerebellum? As I have already mentioned, it's located in the hindbrain. It's a part of hindbrain. It's the largest part of the hindbrain. It's located in the posterior cranial fossa behind the pons and medulla. And separating this pons and medulla and this cerebellum, we can see the fourth ventricle also. So it's an infratentorial structure. In the last session, we have mentioned that tentorium cerebelli, it divides the cranial cavity into a supratentorial portion and an infratentorial portion. And this cerebellum, it is the infratentorial structure or infratentorial part houses the cerebellum. Okay, and it coordinates the voluntary movements. Mainly, it's concerned with the tone, the posture, and the equilibrium of the body. That's the main function of cerebellum. And coming to the relations of cerebellum, I will explain using a diagram. This is cerebellum. This is the posterior part, and this is the anterior part. We have this fourth ventricle. This is the fourth ventricle, its roof. Okay. And anteriorly, we can see the pons and the medulla. Pons and medulla. And posteriorly, we can see the squamous part of the occipital bone. And superiorly, we have the tentorium cerebelli. Okay. Here's another picture. So, this is the posterior part and this is the anterior part. We can see anteriorly, we can see the pons and medulla. And above, we can see the tentorium cerebelli. Okay. And superiorly also, we can see the tentorium cerebelli. And posteriorly, we can see the squamous part of the occipital bone. Now coming to the external features of the cerebellum. So, basically, the cerebellum consists of two hemispheres, which are called cerebellar hemispheres. Right and left cerebellar hemispheres are there, and they are connected And they have two surfaces, a superior surface and an inferior surface. And cerebellum, it consists of two cerebellar hemispheres which are connected by a structure called vermis. It's a worm-like structure which connects the two cerebral hemispheres, cerebellar hemispheres. And superiorly, when we visualize the cerebellar part, superiorly we can see the cerebral hemispheres are continuous or smooth with each other. They are in continuous relation or smooth relation. That is, the vermis is not seen as a separate part. Instead, it mingles or conduits with the cerebellar hemispheres. It mingles or as a smooth surface it is seen. When we visualize the inferior surface, what happens is there is a groove which is called vallecula in which this vermis is housed. Okay, so it has got two cerebellar hemispheres and a median vermis is there. That's a worm-like structure, and it has two surfaces, a superior surface and an inferior surface. When viewed superiorly, we can see the cerebellar hemispheres are continuous with each other with the middle vermis structure called vermis. But the inferior surface, it shows a deep median notch which is called vallecula in which the vermis is housed. And it separates the left and right convex hemispheres. And the anterior aspect of the cerebellum, it is marked by a wide and deep notch. Okay, so here we can appreciate there is a shallow, wide and deep notch is seen in the anterior part of the cerebellum. Okay, so this shallow groove is for the accommodation of the pons and medulla. Here we have the pons and medulla in anteriorly. So in order to accommodate that, this groove is placed like this. It's shallow and wide. Whereas in the posterior part, we have a deep, narrow groove in order to accommodate the false cerebelli. False cerebelli, it separates the posterior part of the cerebellar hemispheres. In order to accommodate that small groove, the deep fissure is seen in the posterior aspect of the cerebellum. Okay. So that's the importance of the grooves. These are the surface features. We have two cerebral hemispheres, and in between we have the vermis. Vermis has different parts also. And anteriorly a shallow and wide groove for the accommodation of bones and medulla, and posteriorly in order to accommodate the false cerebelli, we have a narrow and deep groove. Okay. So that's about the external features of cerebellum. And each hemisphere, as we know, it has got two hemispheres, and each hemispheres, they are again divided into three lobes. Mainly two lobes, that is the corpus cerebelli, which is a main lobe, and one separate lobe called flocculonodular lobe. Okay, and this corpus cerebelli, it is again divided into an anterior lobe and posterior lobe. Posterior lobe is always called middle lobe. Okay, so each hemisphere, basically, this is divided into three lobes. The anterior lobe lies on the anterior part of the superior surface, and it is separated from the middle lobe by a fissura prima. Okay, fissura prima is a fissure that separates the anterior lobe from the middle lobe. Middle lobe is always called posterior lobe also. And there is a small lobe that is called flocculonodular groove. Sorry, flocculonodular lobe. And the middle lobe, it is the largest of three lobes. It is situated on both its inferior and superior aspects. We have the middle lobe that is situated. And it is limited in the front by the eye. It is separated from the anterior lobe by means of a fissure known as fissura prima, which is located on the superior surface of the cerebellum, and by the posterolateral fissure. That's the largest fissure in the cerebellum, and it is formed initially. It's the first fissure to be formed in the development of cerebellum. Okay, though it is called posterolateral fissure due to the folding of the cerebellum. In order to accommodate the brain, different parts of the brain in a small cranial cavity, this various parts of the brain will undergo folding during the development. And in order to accommodate so the cranial cavity is not in accordance with the size of the brain. So in order to fit the brain within the small cranial cavity, the parts of the brain has to undergo certain folding. Like that, the cerebellum is undergone a folding. It's just like a closed book. This posterolateral fissure, though by its name, it is said that it's postero, but it's located anteriorly because of the folding of the cerebellum during development. And flocculonodular lobe is the smallest lobe. So, smallest lobe is the flocculonodular lobe, and the largest lobe is the middle lobe or the posterior lobe. So, it is basically this cerebellum can be divided into corpus cerebelli and flocculonodular lobe, and the corpus cerebelli can be again divided into anterior lobe and posterior lobe, or the middle lobe. Posterior lobe is always called middle lobe since it's situated between the anterior lobe and the flocculonodular lobe. And the anterior lobe is separated from the middle lobe by a fissure known as fissura prima. And this middle lobe is separated from the flocculonodular lobe by means of posterolateral fissure. So, this cerebrum, as I have mentioned, it's just like a closed book. See this? It's a closed book. And when we open this book, like this, when we open the cerebellum, like this, it's seen like this, that is the closed book pattern. And when we open this and visualize, then the image will be looking like this. Okay. So, this is the superior part and this is the inferior part of the cerebellum. So, we have a median structure known as vermis. It's a worm-like structure which separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Sorry, cerebellar hemispheres. Okay. So, we have the vermis and there are different parts for the vermis. The first part is the lingula. This is the superior part. So, I have opened that particular closed book-like structure. So, thereby the image look like this. So, this is a median vermis and it has got certain parts. First part is the lingula. It do not have any lateral extensions. Okay. Other parts of the vermis is having lateral extensions, whereas lingula is not having any lateral extensions. So, this is the superior part. And we have different parts of the this vermis. And this part is the flocculonodular lobe. And here we can see the posterolateral fissure, which is the largest fissure of the cerebellum. And this part, this is called horizontal fissure that separates the superior and inferior aspects of the cerebellum. Okay. And another primary fissure is the fissure which separates the anterior lobe from the middle lobe. Middle lobe is the largest lobe of the cerebellum. Okay. Now coming to the parts of cerebellum. The cerebellum is subdivided into numerous small parts by means of different fissures. The important ones we have discussed now. And each fissure cuts the vermis and the both hemispheres. Vermis is the median structure. And each fissure cuts the vermis and the both hemispheres. And out of the numerous fissures, some of the fissures I have already mentioned, the horizontal fissure, it separates the superior surface from the. So this is the horizontal fissure which separates the superior surface from the inferior surface, and a primary fissure which separates the anterior lobe from the middle lobe. Here we can see the primary fissure. Okay. So primary fissure is always called fissura prima. And again, the posterolateral fissure that's located here, it's the largest one, and it separates the posterior lobe from the, or the middle lobe from the flocculonodular lobe. And the various parts of the cerebellum that we can see in this picture. Okay. So, and each part of the each part of the vermis has a lateral extension that I have already mentioned. Only except lingula, all of the parts of the vermis is having lateral extensions. Okay. So, this is the central lobe. This is the culmen part of vermis. This is decline, folium. These are all parts of this. You don't have to mug it up. Okay. So these are the different parts of vermis. Lingula is the first part and it is not having any lateral extensions. These are important in MDS entrance exams. Not in theory exams, you don't have to mug it. But for the entrance exams, you have to learn it. Okay. So we have these different parts. The central lobule, its lateral extension is always called ala. Okay. And the culmen part, it has the quadrangular lobe, which is the lateral extension of the culmen part of the vermis. Also, we have decline, folium, tuber, pyramid, uvula. Pyramid and uvula are the lowermost parts. Okay. And nodule. Nodule is having, this is the flocculonodular lobule. And this flocculonodular lobule, it is having two parts. One is a nodule from which the lateral extensions known as flocculus is placed. Okay. So that's about the flocculonodular lobe and different parts of cerebellum. Now, we have morphological and functional divisions of cerebellum. And First is the archicerebellum. We can divide this cerebellum according to the morphology and also the function. Functional divisions you don't have to study, but morphological division first is it can be divided into archicerebellum, paleocerebellum, and neocerebellum. Okay, and the archicerebellum, it is phylogenetically according to the evolution, it's the oldest part of the cerebellum, and it is mainly made up of two parts. One is the flocculonodular lobe and the lingular part of the vermis. This constitutes the archicerebellum. So it is seen in lower animals like fish, etc. We can see the archicerebellum more developed, and it is vestibular in its connections. Its connections are mainly vestibular nuclei, and it controls the axial musculature. That's a axial musculature and the bilateral movements used for locomotion and also for the maintenance of equilibrium. This archicerebellum is mainly involved. And next part, the survey is called paleocerebellum. Okay, paleocerebellum, it's the next part of the cerebellum to appear, and it is made up of anterior lobe, except the lingula. Lingula in the archicerebellum, and the paleocerebellum, it's made up of anterior lobe, except the lingula and the pyramid and uvula. That is the lower part. Here we have the pyramid and uvula portion of the vermis. These are involved in the These are the part of paleocerebellum. Okay, so anterior lobe except lingula and the pyramid and uvula of the inferior vermis are all part of paleocerebellum, and its connections, they are chiefly spinocerebellar. Okay, and it controls the tone, posture, and the crude movements. Usually, it is more developed in the terrestrial vertebrates, and hence it's mainly associated with the crude movements of the limbs. Okay, and the next part, or the newest part of the cerebellum, is always called neocerebellum. As the name indicates, it's the newest part or the later part to develop, and it is more developed in the higher animals. That is, in human beings, it's more developed, and it is made up of the posterior or the middle lobe, or the largest part. Largest lobe is the middle lobe, and it is made up of the posterior or the middle lobe, or the largest part of the cerebellum. Okay, except the pyramid and uvula. Pyramid and uvula are involved in the paleocerebellum of the inferior vermis, and it is primarily concerned with the fine movements. So, paleocerebellum is concerned with the crude movement of the limbs, and vestibular part is always called archicerebellum, and the fine movements, they are concerned with the neocerebellum, or the newest part of the cerebellum. Okay. So, now functionally also, these are all transverse sections. These classifications are all based on the transverse sectioning of the cerebellum. But in the functional classification, they are organized as like this. Lateral part is there, an intermediate part and a medial part. Like this, they are dividing. Longitudinally, they are dividing the cerebellum and classifying accordingly. And the lateral zone, it is concerned with the association areas of the brain, and it is involved in the planning and programming of the muscular activities. According to the function, we can divide the cerebellum into three as longitudinal sections. So we have a lateral zone. It is concerned with the association areas of the brain, and it is involved in the planning and programming of the muscular activities. And intermediate zone, it is concerned with the control of muscles of hands, finger, feet, toes, etc. And vermis, or the median part, it is concerned with the control of the muscles of the trunk, neck, shoulders, and hips. And the flocculonodular lobe, as a whole, it is separated, and this lobe functions with the vestibular system in controlling, basically it's controlling the equilibrium part. Okay, equilibrium. So here's the functional classification. This is the lateral part. Okay, it is concerned with the planning and programming of muscles. And control of hands, fingers, feet, etc. is carried out by the intermediate zone, and the median zone, or the vermis, is concerned with the muscles of trunk, neck, shoulders, and hips. And the flocculonodular lobe is considered as a separate part, and it usually functions with the vestibular system in controlling the equilibrium of the body. Now coming to the connections of the cerebellum. So, different fibers enter and leave the cerebellum, and fibers which are anchored to the cerebellum, they are divided into three parts. They are divided into three. Okay, there are three peduncles basically: superior cerebellar peduncle, middle, and Okay, inferior. And the fibers entering or leaving the cerebellum, they are grouped to form three peduncles. Peduncles are also, in Latin, it means small foot, which connect the cerebellum to the superior cerebellar peduncle. It connects the cerebellum with the midbrain. And the middle one, it connects the pons with the cerebellum. And lower or the inferior, it will connect with the medulla. Okay. And the middle and inferior peduncles, they are chiefly afferent to the cerebellum, i.e., it brings impulses from the central nervous system to different parts of the higher centers of the cerebral cortex, cerebrum to cerebellum, i.e., afferent fibers are carried out by the middle and the inferior peduncles. And the superior cerebellar peduncle is chiefly efferent in nature. That means the impulses from the cerebellum is carried to different parts by this superior cerebellar peduncle or efferent fibers. Okay. Afferent means coming from the central nervous system to different parts, and towards central nervous system is the efferent fibers. So this is the superior cerebellar peduncle. It connects the cerebellum with the midbrain. Okay. And middle cerebellar peduncle, it connects the cerebellum with the pons. And inferior cerebellar peduncle, it connects with the medulla. So we are having three peduncles, and they are having mainly the middle and inferior, they are having afferent tracts, and the superior is usually mainly concerned with the efferent tracts. Okay. So superior cerebellar peduncle, it connects the cerebellum to the midbrain, and it is having afferent tracts, i.e., anterior spinocerebellar and tectocerebellar. Okay. And efferent tracts from this cerebellum to different parts, that is cerebellorubral. That means to the red nucleus, and dentathalamic, dentato-olivary, fastigial. This dentate nucleus, fastigial nucleus, that we will be dealing with in the next slides. Okay, they are intercerebellar nuclei. And middle cerebellar peduncle, it connects the cerebellum to the pons, and it's having the afferent tracts, mainly pontocerebellar, the part of cortico-pontocerebellar, cortex to pontine nucleus to cerebellar. Okay, that's the main pathway afferent tract arising from the middle cerebellar peduncle. And inferior cerebellar peduncle, it connects the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. And we have different tracts: posterior spinocerebellar, cuneocerebellar, olivocerebellar, paraolivocerebellar, etc. And the efferent tracts are mainly cerebellovestibular, cerebello-olivary, and cerebello-reticular. Okay. So these are the connections. Mainly, we have three peduncles, and the connections. So superior peduncle is connected with the midbrain, and middle is connected with the pons, and inferior it is connected to the medulla. Okay. And another, we have the outer, when a cerebellum is taken into consideration, we have outer gray matter, and inside that we have the white matter, and inside we have some amount of gray matter that is organized into nuclei. And this nuclei, basically 4 pairs of nucleus are seen inside the cerebellum. They are from the lateral to medial. We can divide them as, first is the nucleus dentatus, which is a larger one, and it is usually associated with the neocerebellar functions. And next is the nucleus emboliformis or paleocerebellar, and medial to that we can see nucleus globosus, and most medial is the nucleus fastigi, which is concerned with the archicerebellar functions. So here we can see the nuclei. Okay. So it's a bag-like structure. This part of the dentate nucleus is called the hilum part. And we have most lateral nucleus is the dentate nucleus. Next is the emboliform. And next is the globose nucleus. And medial to that, we can see the nucleus fastigi. And emboliform and nucleus, globose nucleus, they are together called intermediate nuclei. Okay. Nucleus interpositus, because it is situated in between the nucleus fastigi and the dentate nucleus. And usually this globosus, this intermediate part is concerned with the paleocerebellum, and this outermost dentate nucleus is concerned with the neocerebellum, and fastigi, that is associated with the archicerebellum. Okay, now coming to the histological structure of the cerebellum. So we have already mentioned that cerebellum's structure, it is almost uniform throughout the cerebellum. We can see uniform structure. So it is otherwise called homotypical structure. And when we take into consideration the cerebral cortex, it is vary in different areas. So it is heterotypical. So cerebellum is basically homotypical. Any part of the cerebellum resembles the other part. Okay. And usually we can divide the cerebral cortex into three parts. The outermost or the topmost layer is called the molecular layer, and intermediate to that beneath that we can see the Purkinje layer, and inner to that we can see the granular layer. So cerebral cortex is organized into three layers histologically. The outermost is the molecular layer, and beneath that we can see the Purkinje layer, and beneath that we can see the granular layer. And different cells are seen in different layers. Okay, in the Purkinje layer, that's the most important layer. Only a single layer of Purkinje cells are there. That's somewhat like a flask. This cell is shaped somewhat like a flask, and it's having its axon projected downwards into the interior white matter. Okay, and has a single dendritic process that is ramifying into the molecular layer. So that's the intermediate layer is the Purkinje layer. That's a very important layer. And we have the molecular or the outermost layer. We have two types of cells basically. The inner part, we have the basket cells, and the outermost part, we can see the stellate cells. And granular layer, we can see granular cells and the fibers of the mossy fibers, and also the climbing fibers can be seen in the granular layer. Okay, this is a basic organization of the cerebral cortex. So outermost we can see this is the molecular layer. This part is the Purkinje layer. It's a somewhat flask shape or amoeba shaped cells are having their axons downwards, moving into the white matter, internal white matter, and they have a dendritic process which ramifies and mingles with the fibers in the molecular layer. Okay. Also, the granular cell is seen in the lowermost or the innermost layer. We can see the granular cells. And the basket cells, they are seen in the almost interior of this whole part is the molecular layer. And we can see the basket cells whose axons are located somewhat parallel to this foliate fibers. These leaf-like fibers are seen in the cerebellum, and they are arranged parallel to this molecular layer. Okay, these axons are in this basket cells, the axons are somewhat parallel to the molecular layer. Okay, also the granular cell layer is seen beneath the Purkinje layer, and the axons of the granular cell layer is seen projecting into the molecular layer. Okay. And also the stellate cell is seen in the outermost part of the molecular layer. So basically you have to know the cells, different cells. In the molecular, three layers are there. The molecular layer, Purkinje layer, and beneath that we have the granular layer. And different cells in the molecular layer are basically stellate cells are there, basket cells are there, and the dendritic process of the Purkinje cells are also seen in the molecular layer. And in the middle layer, we can see only the cell bodies of the Purkinje cells. And beneath that, we have the granular layer. In that, we have the axons of the granular cell. In the granular layer, we can see the granular cells, and the axons of the granular cells are seen projecting into the molecular layer. Okay. And also from the deeper parts, from the deeper intracerebellar nuclei, we can see the mossy fibers and climbing fibers they also reach the molecular layer of the cerebral cortex. Not cerebral, cerebellar. Okay. Now coming to the most important cell of the cerebellar cortex. Sorry, it is cerebella, not the cerebral, cerebellar cortex. And the most important cell is, as I already mentioned, it's the Purkinje cell. So it is a characteristic cell of the cerebellum, and it gets stimulated by the climbing fibers coming from the inferior olivary nucleus. Okay. So the climbing fibers, they are rising from the inferior olivary nucleus. And the main output of this cell to the cerebellar nuclei, and it is inhibitory. These all cells, mainly except the granular cells, rest all are inhibitory cells. Granular cells are stimulatory cells. Okay, the main output of this cell is to, so we know that Purkinje cell, their cell bodies are located in the Purkinje layer, and their axons are coming deep down to the interior white matter, or the interior fibrous white matter of the cerebellum. So the main output of the cerebellum is carried out by the axons of the Purkinje cell. Except in the part of flocculonodular lobe, in the part of flocculonodular lobe, what happens is this Purkinje cell axons, they are relaying directly to the vestibular nucleus. Rest others, they are relaying to the intranuclear component of the cerebellum. Okay, this other nucleus called dentate nucleus, like that. Okay, so inner part, we have the granular cell layer, which contains the granule cell, and it receives impulse from the mossy fibers and sent efferent to the Purkinje cell via the parallel fibers. And also the axons of the granular cell, they form the parallel fibers. So the granular cell also, they are sending parallel fibers to the other layers, the molecular layer, and the granular layer also contains, so two types of cells are seen in the granular layer, mainly Golgi cells and the granular cells. These two are inhibitory interneurons. Okay. And mossy fibers, they carry most of the input to the cerebellum. So, input to the cerebellum, they are relayed by the mossy fibers coming from the interior intracerebellar nuclei. And these end in the granular cell layer. And four types of neurons are basically seen in the cerebellum. That is the Purkinje neurons, basket, stellate, and Golgi, which are all inhibitory. Only the granular cells are excitatory. So, five types of cells are there. In the molecular layer, we can see stellate cells, basket cells. And in Purkinje layer, only the Purkinje cells are there. Granular cell layer, we can see the granular cells as well as the Golgi cells. And inner part, we can see the climbing fibers and mossy fibers from the interior white matter of the cerebellum. So, now coming to the blood supply of cerebellum. Blood supply is by mainly 6 arteries. First is the superior part, which is supplied by the two superior cerebellar arteries. And we have two anterior inferior cerebellar arteries and two posterior inferior cerebellar arteries. And superior cerebellar and anterior inferior cerebellar, they are branches of basilar artery, whereas the posterior inferior cerebellar, it is a branch of vertebral arteries. And veins, usually, they drain into the neighboring venous sinuses. We have discussed the venous sinuses in detail in the previous session. Okay. So, now coming to the functions of cerebellum. And cerebellum, it controls basically it controls the same side of the ipsilateral side of the body. And it is in marked contrast with other parts of the brain. Most of the other parts of the brain, that's the cerebral cortex, they are dealing with the contralateral side of the body. And usually the cerebellum, it coordinates voluntary movements so that they are smooth and accurate. Okay. And usually the three things are controlled by the cerebellum. One is the tone, the posture, and the equilibrium. And usually this is chiefly controlled by the archicerebellum as well as the paliocerebellum. The fine motor movements, they are controlled by the neocerebellum. So, as we have already mentioned in the functional classification, this flocculonodular lobe, it is mainly connected to the vestibular nuclei. I.e., the Purkinje fibers that are coming from the flocculonodular lobe, that is connected directly to the vestibular nuclei, whereas the other fibers from the other parts of the cerebellum, the fibers from the Purkinje cells, they are connected to the intranuclear part, cerebellar nucleus associated with the cerebellum. Okay. Only from the flocculonodular lobe, the output is coming to the vestibular nuclei. So it is involved in the maintenance of the muscle tone and the posture. And spinocerebellum, vermis, and intermediate regions receive afferents from the motor cortex via the cortico-pontocerebellar fibers. Paliocerebellum is always called spinocerebellum. Okay. Other name for paliocerebellum is spinocerebellum. And the neocerebellum is always called cerebrocerebellum. And all the sensory informations of the muscles, joints, cutaneous, auditory, and visual parts are relayed in the spinocerebellum. And usually the spinocerebellar tracts, they carry information from the same side. As compared to other parts, these are also carrying information from the ipsilateral aspect of the body. And the vermal part, that controls the axial muscles and thus maintains the posture of the body. And the paramedian areas, they are involved in the control of a distal group of muscles to bring a smooth coordinated activity. So basically, cerebellum receives information from the cerebrum as well as spinal cord, and they compare the information, and it corrects and modifies the ongoing movements through thalamocortical projections, reticulospinal and rubrospinal tracts, thereby modifying the different movements and maintaining the posture, tone, and equilibrium of the body. So, neocerebellum, it is concerned with the it's concerned with the fine tuning of the motor performance for precise movements. That is, the advanced functions are dealt by the neocerebellum. That is mainly developed in the higher vertebrates like human beings. And it helps in the planning and production of skilled movements along with the cerebrum. Okay, so when we visualize a functional magnetic resonance, MRI, if the fingers of the right hand are moved repetitively, it is the activity is seen in the precentral gyrus of the left cerebral cortex, whereas anterior quadrangular lobe of right cerebellar hemisphere. That means the right side is controlled by the right cerebellum, whereas it is controlled by when the cerebral aspect is concerned, the opposite side is controlled by the cerebrum. Okay. So, thank you for your patient listening. This is a small topic. You don't have to mug all the nucleus and the names of the different parts of the vermis, but generally you have to study different parts. Okay. So, this is a brief overview of cerebellum. Thank you and good night.